Welcome, one and all, to another episode of Heavy Hands. I am your host, Connor Rebush. With me, as always, is Phil McKenzie. You know what, Phil? Last week I introduced you just sort of off on a whim, because there were people from our previous episode. I sort of hemmed and hawed about what to call you. You know, of course, Patrick Wyman, may he rest in peace, was the good doctor for such a long time. And I was like, well, what's Phil's title? And we had a lot of suggestions. And then last week on a whim, I called you Viscount Phil McKenzie. And at least a few people were upset that their suggestions were not chosen. One person said that the mere usage of the word Viscount felt like a bullshit history brag. Because I do, in fact, know what a Viscount is. It's important to my listeners that they know that I know what a Viscount is. But we may as well mix it up. One person was really heartbroken that I didn't call you the Reverend Phil McKenzie. So you're the Reverend Phil McKenzie this week. And how are you, my friend?
Feeling holy.
Yes, and sounding holy. I mean, just that angelic voice.
Indeed. Looking forward to some action fights, which will, bring blessings upon all of us next weekend.
Yes, may it be so. We are here to talk to you, as we usually are, about some fights that are about to happen and some fights that just happened. For the former, we are looking ahead to the UFC's return to London, England, and the main event of this card, Darren Till, fresh off of his, let's say it, a humiliatingly one-sided loss to Tyron Woodley, is taking on, no less humiliating than Tyron Woodley's loss to Kamaru Usman. Let's be real. The score has been evened. But Darren Till has a lot to prove here, I think, against Jorge Masvidal. Pretty exciting welterweight matchup there. Two interesting strikers, although we will talk about the particulars of the style matchup a little more later. We're also looking at the co-main event. Leon Edwards is fighting Gunnar Nelson, another really interesting welterweight fight. Very much looking forward to that one. And then light heavyweights, Volkan Oezdemir, erstwhile title challenger, is taking on Dominic Reyes, who many of us expect will be a title challenger sometime very soon, very likely with a win over Volkan Oezdemir. So that's a meaningful fight. We may be getting to a couple of the others on this undercard as well, because there are some other meaningful fights. We got prospects like Arnold Allen, Joe Duffy's coming back. There's some good stuff. Nathaniel Wood is fighting Jose Alberto Quinones. I think that sounds like fun as well. So we'll be talking about as much of that as we can, but definitely those top three. And then later on, in segment 3, we are going to get to our recap of last week's events. Junior Dos Santos knocked out Derek Lewis in the second round of sort of an unexpectedly messy fight, but maybe that's just what it is when you step in there with Derek Lewis. Elizeu Zaleski Dos Santos defied our predictions for another Ponzinibbio Taleb type matchup by kicking the shit out of Curtis Melender's legs, taking him down, and then tying him into a pretzel on the ground. And there was some other stuff as well. We'll be getting to that later. For now, Darren Till, Jorge Masvidal. Phil, what are your feelings generally on this matchup?
I think in general, this card is a lot of fun. I think we're looking at ESPN Plus pacing, which has proven to be excellent thus far.
Yes, it has been so... Can you imagine last week's card, the undercard especially, with Fox Sports 1 pacing?
No.
It would have been...
I don't want to.
Utterly brutal. So grateful for that, at least. This one should be good, especially with the fast pace, no doubt.
Yep. Pretty much all of the fights on this card are going to be either interesting or action-packed, and many of them are going to be both. The fight at the top of the card, I'm sort of concerned that this might not actually be all that good. Are you all? Do you share this concern?
It's a distinct possibility, my friend, because not only do we have Darren Till, who famously had a fight of the year contender with Stephen Wonderboy Thompson before his title shot against Tyron Woodley. We also have Jorge Masvidal, who's sort of famously inconsistent and sometimes just doesn't seem to wake up for his fights. You can imagine that the slow-paced sniping style of Darren Till could potentially bring the worst out of Masvidal as well. So it might not be great.
So watching a bunch of tape on this and surrounding fights in and around the welterweight division, it's kind of struck me that a lot of the recent fights in this weight class have been focused around defense, but they've been between fighters who aren't all that good at it. And that may be somewhat controversial. But
can you give me an example? Like, what's another fight in which that fits that?
So Till Thompson is the classic one.
Okay, sure.
But also Till Masvidal, Thompson Masvidal as well, is that, but also, Thompson Woodley, is that they've been kind of cautious fights a lot of the time, where people have been very sort of cagey about opening up their offense. But it's not like any of these guys really have tremendous defensive layers beyond their feet.
Oh, yeah.
And their range.
And Stephen Thompson, I think, is... I don't want to upset Luca Bordone or anything, but he's probably kind of streets ahead of these two in terms of how good his defensive footwork actually is.
Yeah.
And he's still... It's just that.
Yeah, it is just feet. Like, when you catch up... So a lot of people have... It strikes me that a lot of these guys have been insulated either by reach or by foot speed, or by both, in the case of Stephen Thompson. And this is really what struck me in Jorge Masvidal's fight with Stephen Thompson, is that Masvidal is not really thought of as being a defensively defunct fighter, but in part, I felt like that is because he's always been so much taller than everyone he's fought at lightweight. And even then, it's more been the fact that people have had to fight past his jab and that he's such a superlative, like, defensive wrestler and clinch fighter that has sort of insulated him from that, because he's not actually all that hard to hit. And this is one of the problems which has sort of made him that inconsistent fighter, going back to things like, the Melendez loss in Strikeforce, is that when Gilbert just walked him down, he was kind of able to do that. If he was just able to come through the jab and bite down, he was able to kind of fuck Masvidal up on the feet
and really shut his offense down. Masvidal, like Nick Diaz, is like one of those fighters who can become defensively responsible, and mostly it just consists of staying moving and keeping his guard high. But he's not much of a counterpuncher. When he gets put into that defensive shell, it really does tend to, or it can at least, look a lot like a shell.
Yeah, and so similarly we have in that way, this matchup might end up looking a good deal like the Thompson Masvidal matchup, which is that I suspect when Till wants to hit Masvidal, he probably can, and he is probably a bigger puncher than Thompson is. If in some ways a slightly less willing one, he's much less likely to, like, Thompson at least will throw in combination if he blitzes forward. Till it really is just likely to feint with the right and come with the left. But that's sort of been something which has plagued Masvidal, even in things like the what's another one to reference? The fight against boring Russian dude who lost recently.
Khabilov,
yes, there we go. In that, like, against big explosive guys with reach parity, Masvidal has not been able to, like, shut them down as well as he would, say, a Ally Quinta. So
interesting recent counter to that, Donald Cerrone,
who also has the same problem but worse.
True, but I think that's interesting in this matchup because, like, I do want to say just before we move on, the southpaw thing might also give Masvidal problems. I haven't really come down to a solid conclusion on that, but having his defense and distance management so reliant on that jab, I noticed he didn't really let many of those jabs go in the fight with Stephen Thompson. Thompson fought largely in southpaw in that bout. So that could be an issue here against Darren Till. Masvidal just not even offering his, like, preventative defense in the form of smart technical offense. But Darren Till's kind of the same way, isn't he? Like, Darren Till's not much of a counterpuncher. That was a big factor in the Thompson-Masvidal fight, is that Masvidal just, because he didn't have much nuanced defense, like, Thompson was able to time him coming in and change angles and sneak in these weird combinations. Combinations especially were effective, going head to body and so on and so forth. Darren Till doesn't do any of that. He's also not much of a counterpuncher. He's kind of bad defensively when he backs up as well.
Yep.
So
no argument there.
Does this feel like a matchup of who gets to pressure, of who comes forward, decides it?
So, I mean, I think that you're right, that the Southpaw equation does seem like it's one that might trouble Masvidal a bit. Because, his offense in that fight in the open stance was largely him looking to either land the stomp or the outside leg kick, and then use that to step into his right hand. But Stephen Thompson was already miles away by the time he was ever looking to land the right hand.
He got to him with one big wide left hook. It was the only one of the
fight. So I'm not sure how he steps in to land necessarily. But again, it's one of these ones where these guys should match up for a good fight on the surface, but I'm just not sure that they will. Like, admittedly, like Masvidal, when he was losing that Thompson fight, did decide to pressure more and then got fucked up more for it. And I'm hoping that whether that succeeds or fails, I'm hoping that he does that. If he gets into a kind of jousting match with Till and he starts being on the losing end of it, I at least have more confidence in him to try and press the fight.
Yeah. If Masvidal fights the fight that he fought against Stephen Thompson, I would actually favor him pretty confidently here. The big issue for me is like not knowing whether or not I can expect that out of Masvidal. But I think he's better defensively when put on the defensive than Darren Till. Darren Till, I mean, we haven't seen a lot of people pressuring Darren Till, but Till's in this awkward position as a UFC fighter where like he hasn't fought that many good fighters. You know what I mean? Like he kind of ran up through the lengths. He fought Nicholas Dalby, in which, he kind of handled Dalby and then got brutally fucked up in the third round after injuring himself, and also gassing, it has to be said. Jason Ayari, Bojan Velichkovic, a fight in which he knocked Velichkovic down twice, but also ate a shitload of leg kicks and could not finish him. Donald Cerrone, first round knockout. Stephen Thompson, barely a fight. So like there's still a lot of questions about Darren Till. He's kind of in that Cody Garbrandt territory where I'm still kind of like, well, how good is he?
Yeah.
I still don't trust him to fight 5 rounds consistently, especially if Masvidal can bring a pace to him. I don't think he can, he's just huge. So I think the size alone is going to be draining him as the fight goes on. I also haven't seen him face, he hasn't been pressed by many people. That's the point that brought me to this. That's right. He hasn't been pressed by many people. Masvidal coming forward, throwing those left hooks, throwing those leg kicks, and just trying to answer counters with increased aggression, I think could have a really good effect against Darren Till. The other thing is, Darren Till has not fought a ton of great wrestlers. In fact, I think it has to be said, Masvidal is by far the best wrestler he will have ever faced.
Yep.
And that is a huge strength for Masvidal in my book. Like, he's inconsistent, he's got his problems, but he's truly one of the most well-rounded fighters in the sport today. You can say there are holes in every phase of his game, but he can do everything and has real strengths in every single area of MMA. And I find it hard to expect Darren Till, if Masvidal fights that way, to maintain the pace, to stuff all the takedowns, and to work his way back into the fight if he's not given the chance to come forward at a slow pace to pick his shots. So I would pick Masvidal really confidently if I could trust him to fight that way. The problem is, I think you're right. It's one of those matchups where both guys have essentially the same, it's one of those mirror matches. Both guys have essentially the same flaws, exploitable by their opponents can exploit their weaknesses in the exact same way, and so they both choose that the best thing to do is to not really try too hard. You know what I mean? It's the striker's version of when two grapplers fight and have a bad kickboxing match. That's essentially what we saw when Darren Till and Stephen Thompson fought. Is a good chance we'll see something like that here too. I agree.
Yeah, I will say one thing in Thompson's actual meaningful fight in the UFC, which is the Wonder Boy one, as terrible as that fight was, and it was utter dog shit. The one thing about that fight is that it did look like Till did one thing which some some other very good fighters haven't, which is that he kind of solved Thompson by the end of that fight.
He kicked his legs.
Yeah. But I mean, there were basically 4 meaningless rounds where nothing happened. And then the last round where Till had actually it looked like Till had actually kind of figured Thompson out. And he finally realized, all I need to do is I need to come forward, feint the jab a whole bunch of times, get him running backwards at warp speed, and then punch him.
Yeah.
Like, that's... It doesn't seem like it was rocket science, but like very few people seem to have actually done that.
Yeah.
And that is actually something that Masvidal does not tend to do. He's not a tremendous adaptive fighter. Like, he's not someone that is confronted by frustrating style matchups and then tends to like solve them over time. So if I'm expecting, I don't trust Masvidal to force a pace on Till to gas him out. And if Till isn't being gassed out, because I like you, I still don't trust his cardio, I do trust him more than Masvidal to make adjustments over a 5-round fight.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Masvidal sort of patently a non-adjuster. That's kind of that may in fact be his main drawback, is that he finds himself in tough situations, having not prepared the right game plan or whatever, and just flatlines. The fight just progresses as it has been progressing.
He has two flaws, which was his tendency to get flash knockdown in every first round, and his other tendency to coast late. Like, combining those two, you have you can realize why this immensely skilled, like physically gifted fighter, like, hasn't had the kind of spectacular career you might have necessarily expected from him.
Yeah. He hasn't quite made that late career turn that like Mousasi seems to make, where it's like, oh, I should fight in a way that that builds, where each next move builds off the one before. Yeah, I'm with you. I still
also because he's at lightweight and welterweight, and Mousasi is in the Bellator middleweight division.
That is a very fair point. Yeah, I'm still going to take Masvidal here, though. I just don't trust Till. I don't trust either of these guys, but I there's so much I don't know about Till. At the very least, I know all of the holes in Jorge Masvidal's game. I know what his weaknesses are. I suspect that Till shares many of them, but also that Masvidal is, just by virtue of being super well-rounded and extremely skilled everywhere, better suited to take advantage of this. It'll be a huge indictment on Masvidal if he doesn't come into this fight having already prepared to take Till down, especially as the fight goes on.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. I think he is the more skilled fighter in a great many areas, but I just can't trust him.
Yeah.
Like, to actually put it together against, at least, I mean, Till, I don't find him to be a particularly diverse or like tremendously well-constructed fighter, but he does know how to stick to his bread and butter religiously.
Mm-hmm.
And even though I think a 5-rounder is actually better for Masvidal, because it will allow him time to, like, A, get a potential slow start out of the way, and B, wake up when he starts coasting. But I think I would probably favor Till more strongly over 3 rounds, but I still slightly favor Till just because I can't trust. I've seen Masvidal win fights where I thought he was the more I've seen Masvidal lose fights where he was the more technical fighter too many times.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, well, that's your main event of UFC Till versus Masvidal. After this, let's see, we'll take a break. When we come back, we are going to get into the next welterweight fight in this card, Leon Edwards versus Gunnar Nelson, and then the light heavyweights, Volkan Oezdemir, Dominic Reyes, and whatever else we can squeeze in after this break.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it.
Welcome back to Heavy Hands. Moving on through the UFC's upcoming London card. Leon Edwards, Gunnar Nelson. Is there similar potential for a frustrating fight here, Phil, or do you think this one is more guaranteed to give us action?
I think this one is more guaranteed to give us action, but then I don't have a soul-deep loathing in my heart for both these fighters like you do.
I like Leon Edwards.
Do you?
Yeah, of course I hate Gunnar Nelson. I want him to be destroyed, and you know, I hope that his entire home of Iceland sinks into the sea, but Leon Edwards is a pretty good guy.
But he angers you, because doesn't he also annoy you because you can't tell what he's good at?
I don't think so. Maybe in the past I've been somewhat frustrated. He is a weirdly, he's a spoiler kind of fighter. But I kind of like Leon Edwards. I kind of enjoy, those boring-ass, workman-like, but very respectable wins that he tends to rack up. Nelson frustrates me a lot more than Edwards. I kind of know what the fuck Edwards wants out of a fight. I mean,
and just to narrow this down, you do know that liking Lyoto Machida and not liking Gunnar Nelson is wrong, right? Because those two are the same person.
You do know that comparing the two of them is in fact a crime which should be punishable by something worse than death. How dare you? And you know what? I don't have to come up with a new nickname for you, Phil. You're off the show. Replacing you with the fucker who complained because I called you Viscount.
All right. I had a good run, and I'll just tune in to listen to it next week.
History will judge.
To you and Viscount fucker.
We will let history determine whether your run was in fact good. But yeah, I guess you think there's more potential. Probably, because I don't think Gunnar Nelson is going to be content to allow. Leon Edwards is the party here who I would expect to actually do more to turn this into a real snooze fest. And I don't think Gunnar Nelson is really structured enough to allow that. I will say, I think I did redeem myself very slightly for the Nelson fans out there by picking him over Cowboy Oliveira. And I was very nearly wrong. I was very, very nearly wrong the first time I actually picked him. But what do you see? What's the action element in this matchup that makes you view it a little more favorably than the main event?
Just that I think that Leon Edwards has a pretty good grasp of how to approach his opponents.
Sure.
And from this perspective, the answer is pressure Gunnar Nelson, and because he has pretty bad defense.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we've kind of seen how Leon Edwards can approach this kind of fight when we saw him against Vicente Luque. Mm. And this is one of the things I like about Leon Edwards, is that he's one of these fighters whose relatively, perhaps slightly unimpressive looking wins have actually aged really well.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, some of them were surprising on the face of it, like submitting Albert Tumanov.
Mm-hmm.
But things like his Luque and Barberena wins were actually they've actually aged really well.
Mm-hmm. Both of those guys' stock may have gone up recently, around the same date, Barberena and Luque.
Yeah, and just the fact that Luque's on a crazy streak of all finishes. And that's one of the things that really stands out, is that Luque didn't get much going against Edwards.
Mm-hmm.
And he is a big-time puncher, big-time submission threat. And rewatching that fight, what stood out to me was the fact that it was Luque. I always remembered that fight as Edwards out-wrestling Luque. But what stood out to me was the fact that actually it was Luque that initiated the grappling because he was losing on the feet.
Mm-hmm.
And whilst we've sort of been relatively impressed with Edwards, I mean, not relatively impressed, but it's been more what has defined his fights has been his wrestling lately. Mm-hmm. It is, he has been able to land relatively defensively responsible, long, straight punches on guys like Vicente Luque and Donald Cerrone without ever really getting into trouble. Mm-hmm. And Gunnar Nelson, I mean, much as we sort of, we sort of discussed the last time out, he's not a tremendously deep fighter. Basically has a crackling 1-2. He can hit a nice set of reactive takedowns, and he's incredibly good at taking the back. And that's sort of it. Mm-hmm. He's not what I would describe as a tremendously defensively sound fighter. And Edwards has, apart from his early loss to Kamaru Usman, in which he did better than literally anyone else, he has been pretty hard to out-wrestle.
Even there, like Usman, Edwards wrestled fairly competitively with Usman. That was like the first performance, I think, where we're like, I don't quite understand what he's doing, but he's actually kind of competing. He's got good head position, and he's really good footwork in these clinches. He's not easy to get a hold on at all. Donald Cerrone timed quite a few good shots on Leon Edwards and couldn't come close to completing one. He's you know what is Leon Edwards kind of doing with his newly well-rounded skill set what you wish Jorge Masvidal would do? Like, he's just constantly using all of the elements in exactly the way they probably should be used.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing, is that we've seen sort of the specialist focus in MMA, and it's been a sort of broader. It hasn't really been so much of a change as it's been like the best fighters do tend to be specialists in one way or another, but there's still value in being able to outstrike, one part of the Venn diagram and then out-wrestle the other part.
Yeah, no doubt. And being able to do both against both. Like, a lot of his success against Cerrone was on the feet at range, but also really good wrestling, really great clinch striking as well.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. He was, and again, this is another area where I'm not really sure that I trust Gunnar Nelson to really have much depth in clinch exchanges.
Yeah, me
This was, remembering the Rick Story fight, for example. Mm-hmm. So I kind of favor Leon Edwards relatively strongly in this one. I mean, the only one which gives me real concern is that Peter Sabota fight with Leon Edwards, because it was closer than it needed to be.
But you know what? I got to give some credit to Peter Sabota. Mm-hmm. Peter Sabota, this is like, I heard people from last week's card also decrying Beneil Dariush, who got a really impressive comeback win. Because he made Drew Dober look like an elite striker. And I think saying that sort of undersells the development that Drew Dober has been undergoing recently as a striker. If you've been paying careful attention, he's been appearing much more powerful and more dangerous in the pocket, sitting down in his shots a lot more. Peter Sabota, since what did he have, like a bad fight with like Pavel Pavlak, Steve Kennedy, he had that body kick loss to Kyle Noak. And ever since that Kyle Noak fight, he has been coming in and kind of murking people with his hands. He outstruck Nicholas Dalby and Ben Saunders both, which is
easily.
Yeah, which isn't incredible, maybe, like on the level of beating someone like Donald Cerrone, perhaps, but he still very confidently outstruck the both of them. So, I think he gave Edwards a good scrap, but Edwards still very clearly won it. My concern would be more that Gunnar Nelson is much more dangerous in single moments than pretty much anyone except for Luque that Edwards has fought. And Edwards is one of those fighters who tends to get cracked really, really hard, like once a fight. Cerrone hit him with a huge uppercut. Barberena knocked him down with an almost identical huge uppercut. I can't remember who else has tagged him, actually, but it does tend to happen. I think Dominic Waters even fucking nailed him in their fight. It tends to happen. It seems to be uppercuts, in fact. I might be inventing this, but I think Waters hit him with a big uppercut. But so there's that. Like, if Nelson can time one really good powerful shot, one really good right hand, it could start a snowball effect that just quickly goes downhill for Edwards. But otherwise, I have to agree. Like, I trust Edwards a lot more than I trust Nelson to fight intelligently. I think he's going to pressure. I think he is going to feint, something he does quite well. You can critique Edwards for his lack of volume, but he throws a lot more apparent volume than people give him credit for. He keeps his opponents thinking. And he's really, really comfortable staying like right on the end of punching range. He will walk somebody down, stay right in their face, and just feint and make them react, make them miss. I think he's going to feint Nelson and very likely hit him with a really big counter. Because that's something that Nelson has not dealt with very often, something he has never dealt with particularly well. When he has been faced with it is not getting hit while he is trying to hit someone. What little defense he has pretty much evaporates once he starts thinking offense. And Edwards is a pretty damn good counterpuncher. So I'm thinking, pressure, frankly, better chain wrestling, in my opinion, when it does get to the clinch, and just a lot more. Edwards is just like really dutiful when it comes to crossing his T's, dotting his I's. The clinch elbows against Cerrone were a small detail, but they were instrumental in how that fight played out, and he never missed an opportunity to break the clinch on his terms every time he got it. I think he's a fighter who some of his wins don't look that impressive, but it's because he finds these little small chinks in the opponent's armor and just keeps wheedling away at them until they're kind of mentally broken and extremely frustrated. And I think that's what's going to happen here. So I'll take Leon Edwards pretty strongly as well. I think it's a pretty good matchup for him. Let's move on then. Light heavyweights. Volkan Oezdemir, Dominic Reyes. Do you want to libelously accuse me of hating one of these fighters, Phil? Because it's Volkan Oezdemir. Because I do. It's Volkan Oezdemir.
I just want to warn you and to warn any of the listeners, don't get your heart broken.
Yes. Volkan Oezdemir is going to boop Dominic Reyes into...
He's going to boop him so bad.
He's going to boop him in the first 40 seconds of the fight, and the hype train is over. That's the end of Dominic Reyes as a prospect. It's light heavyweight, folks. We've been here before.
We're not even going to know what has happened. Like... They'll just be clenched up, and then suddenly Reyes will stumble out of it and fall flat on his face. Mm-hmm. And then only in the replay will you see Oezdemir like grazing him with a backwards up elbow in the temple or something. Mm-hmm. And you'll be like, well,
yeah. In the midst of the clinch, Oezdemir opened his hand, and the thumb flicked the bottom of Dominic Reyes' chin and just killed him instantly. So barring something like that, barring something that will almost certainly happen because it's light heavyweight and everything's bad, Dominic Reyes is probably going to fuck Oezdemir up, right? He's way better at everything that Oezdemir does.
Yes, I would, with the strong caveat that this is light heavyweight, the graveyard of dreams. Expect him to win this fight.
That asterisk is always there with this division, but like if I had to find a parallel, this is like a Jędrzejczyk. I've forgotten her name because she's so unimportant to me. No, Jędrzejczyk Kowalkiewicz type of thing, where it's like, okay, like one person's just faster, has longer reach, significantly better footwork, and otherwise is similar in a lot of ways. So it's just kind of like a mirror match where, like,
keeps a better pace.
Yeah.
Hits visibly harder, although has less weird magic powers.
Yep, significantly better defense. Defense that he uses aggressively. I mean, good counters from Dominic Reyes. Just everything, right? Like, so do we want to, like, let's take just a moment. Just a moment to break down like why it will be tragic when Dominic Reyes is booped into the afterlife seconds into this fight. Like, he's the
last hope.
Yeah, he's the only thing left worth getting excited for in the light heavyweight division. I'm sorry, folks, Johnny Walker, he's not going to do it. Okay? It's not going to work out for him in the long run. He's just not reliable. I can't believe. I won't allow myself to believe. But Dominic Reyes, he looks so much like a good fighter.
Houston Alexander is for real, Connor.
Reyes looks so much like a good fighter. He
does.
So technically put together.
Right.
And a good athlete.
Got to think.
And really big.
How much is he trying? Yeah, you got to think how badly is he trying to trick us by doing that?
Son of a bitch.
What is the game he is trying to play?
Yeah.
By trying to look like he's good.
I don't know. Boost Volkanovski's stock?
Yeah, I mean, he beat OSP really, really easily.
Yeah.
And OSP is weird and difficult to look good against, and Oezdemir looked like dog shit against him, and I don't even think Oezdemir beat him. So he's proven that he can beat weird stuff sometimes.
Yeah.
And that he can do a very convincing impression of a good fighter.
Mm-hmm.
And
so if you had to guess,
for me to pick him over Oezdemir.
Yeah, what would you expect out of this matchup? Just like a brief rundown of the style matchup. Like, what is this fight going to look like? Up until that fateful moment.
I think Oezdemir is a reasonable power puncher who still has major issues with range.
Mm-hmm.
He's again like someone who doesn't really have much in the way of defense at all. But he's perfectly willing to kind of bite down and swing in the pocket. He's a pretty good clinch fighter, but mostly I just expect to see Reyes beating him to the punch a lot. Like he's just a longer, straighter, more accurate puncher from the outside. I think Oezdemir is crafty enough to probably land a few counters on him, which will mean that we'll probably see Reyes' chin tested a bit.
Sure.
But I think Oezdemir is also a more willing, offensive wrestler than he's sometimes given credit for.
Sure.
But I think again in that OSP fight, I was genuinely pretty impressed by how well Reyes' takedown defense held up. So yeah, like you said, I think it really is kind of a fight where one of these guys just looks like he kind of does almost everything better than the other guy.
Yeah, I'm thinking, for me, if I had to pick a factor, I'd say footwork is going to be the big difference here. Reyes moves really well for a guy his size. I mean, he moves really well for an MMA fighter in general, but for a light heavyweight MMA fighter, he tends to maintain his stance constantly, very rarely crosses his feet or brings them close together. He's always in a balanced position, which is why a big part of why the defense and the counters come so easily to him. He's just not off balance when somebody's throwing strikes at him. He's got some nice pivots in his arsenal that he will counter off of, and he complements all of this with long range and what look like significantly quicker strikes than what Oezdemir is capable of mustering. So probably Oezdemir getting picked apart, but when I say that, you know what I really mean.
Yep.
Okay, what else from this card piques our interest? We're really just going to sort of name drop and mention, maybe give some quick picks. And God, I hope that no one expect me to stick to these picks if I take a much closer look at these fights and then change my mind by the vivisection. Okay, I only stick to my guns if it's a really, really well considered pick.
So Mark Giacchese and Joe Duffy is a terribly booked fight considering how much raw physical potential Mark Giacchese has. They just seem to be trying to kill him.
They want to destroy him.
I would expect Joe Duffy to win that, with the slight caveat that Mark Giacchese is a ridiculous athlete who may just blow his head off with something.
I think there's a significant chance that Giacchese could fling him around too. I mean, Giacchese really likes to tie up, and he's a super physical, if not a very technical wrestler.
Yeah,
and Duffy's not much of an athlete and not a great wrestler. Poirier largely, he was super dangerous in that Poirier fight, and Poirier sort of took over around the time he figured out that he could take him down whenever he wanted.
Yeah, that's a good take.
So yeah,
favoring Giacchese?
I would pick Duffy as well. Giacchese is just so wild and formless, but he could very well, in my mind, stumble into the right game plan in that matchup. So
Yeah, no, that's a really good take. Nathaniel Woods, Jose Alberto Quinones. Again, should be this is the thing. This card is stacked with just like awesome action fights.
Mm-hmm.
Again, Nathaniel Wood, I like him just because he's just more offensively capable, frankly.
Yeah.
Quinones he's super tough and keeps an amazing pace, but he's like Nathaniel Wood just hits harder and he's just a better striker.
Yeah. I've really liked Jose Quinones' development in his recent fights. Like that win over Teruta Ishihara was sort of all of that coming to fruition, like his performance where he got to prove that he'd been working really hard on becoming a better fighter. Footwork, boxing in general, but footwork especially has gotten a lot better for him. He's a really like sort of high energy, agile, bouncy, movement heavy fighter. I think it's an interesting test for Nathaniel Wood. I don't think he's fought a fighter exactly with this style that I can think of. But the offensive potency is big, and also like the thing that has marked out Nathaniel Wood now in his 2 UFC fights has been two things: really gritty, doesn't get shaken, fights back without a problem. He was in serious trouble in the Johnny Eduardo fight, fought right through it, but also that he has looked really well prepared for his opponents. Now, granted, both Andre Ewell and Johnny Eduardo maybe not the best tests in terms of like if you want to take those guys down, if part of your game plan is to mix things up, you're going to get the chance probably more so than you might with a movement heavy fighter and a decent clinch wrestler like Jose Quinones. But he did look really well prepared for both of those guys, and that Ewell fight in particular. Like again, really obvious holes in Ewell's style, but Wood did exactly what he should have done with them. So I will take him to come in here and just basically fight to win a little harder than I've ever really seen Quinones do.
And
then finally,
any other ones jumping out to you? I mean, Marshman Phillips should be hilarious. Again, these are ones I don't really have any particular picks out there for now.
Yep.
Marshman Phillips should just be hilarious fun. Tom Breese, Ian Heinisch. I'm always interested in seeing how well Tom Breese develops. I think he's a really interesting prospect at middleweight.
Mm-hmm.
And Mike Grundy, Nad Narimani should actually be really it should be a really solid solid affair because Grundy he's a really interesting prospect.
Mm-hmm.
He's a strong wrestler, but then like Narimani is a real like high work rate grinder.
Narimani was
I think that should be like a really physical draining fight, which will be I think actually pretty interesting to watch.
I agree. Yeah, I really like Nad Narimani. He was kind of like the Cage Warriors go-to elite gatekeeper / standby title challenger. For a while he was over there, and for good reason. Like he's just one of those guys who's a perpetual tough out, high paced, really well rounded. Just super scrappy. Speaking of scrappy, last one I want to talk about really briefly: Arnold Allen, Jordan Rinaldi.
Yes.
Pretty interesting to me actually. Rinaldi maybe doesn't like raise eyebrows as much as Allen, but Arnold Allen is really scrappy. It's kind of his defining characteristic is willing to fight super hard and recklessly everywhere. And it is rare that he has a fight where he doesn't end. I mean, I don't know if he's ever had a fight where he doesn't end up in a bad position, where he doesn't get hit hard early, get taken down early. He's a remarkably good scrambler, like we saw in the Makwan Amir Khani fight. Amir Khani took him down with ease, which is worrisome, but couldn't really control him at all. In either of the 2 rounds that he got those early takedowns in.
Allen just kind of wore him down.
Yeah, but having to fight that way, Rinaldi doesn't look that easy to wear down, and he's a solid, a quality submission wrestler who knows exactly what his style is. So he's going to come out and try and take Allen down. It's going to be a fairly one-note approach, and I would expect Allen to, through sheer scrappiness and creativity, find a way out of that. But, those determined specialist approaches Allen is the kind of well-rounded fighter whose well-roundedness can really be taken advantage of by a specialist, because he's just willing to do everything. We saw that when Mads Brunel was pretty soundly outboxing him, and then Allen came back to win that. I think Rinaldi might potentially give him some similar problems, but in the wrestling department. So,
yeah, I think it's going to be a tough one for Allen. I might actually pick Rinaldi, but I probably need to watch a bit more tape on it before I solidified my pick. But
I feel the same
it's because I mean, that Amirkhani fight was very close, and Amirkhani, like, for a comparison, had a lot more trouble than Rinaldi did in fighting Jason Knight and keeping him down and outworking him. Rinaldi did that pretty easily, frankly.
Yep.
And we've discussed, when you're changing weight classes, it should be at least part of as a focus of what you want to do. And Rinaldi is someone who his focus is grappling. It helps to be big. He's moved down from lightweight, and he looks a lot better.
And if that night fight, that MMA math is indicative of, like, Amirkhani not being just generally not being as good of a top control fighter as Rinaldi is, then yeah, Allen could be in real trouble. Scrappiness alone doesn't do much if the opponent just sticks you on your back and doesn't give you space to breathe. So yeah, interesting fight there. Interesting card all around, actually. Really looking forward to it. And again, thank the Lord for ESPN Plus pacing. It's been phenomenal so far. Such an improvement from the Fox Sports 1 days. Already feel like I've got my money's worth with this transition. So all of that makes this look like a pretty enticing lineup. So let's call that segment 2. When we come back, we are going to look back at last week's event in Wichita. Junior Dos Santos fought Derek Lewis in the main event, as Zaleski Dos Santos fought Curtis Millender, and more besides after this.
Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are 1 or 2 of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. You can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show.
All right, welcome back to Heavy Hands. Let's go ahead and talk about the violence in Wichita. Junior Dos Santos, Derek Lewis, the predominant take on this fight online. I missed this one live. I actually caught much of this card live and then headed out before the main event. I really wanted to see Elysiu. But the predominant story surrounding it online seems to be that Junior Dos Santos fought a crazy, reckless fight that he did not need to fight against Derek Lewis. What's your opinion on that take?
I agree.
It was a little messy, wasn't it?
Yeah. I honestly kind of do agree. I like the main weapon that everyone was calling for in this fight was the jab. And if JDS couldn't land his jab on Lewis, it's indicative of 2 things which are relatively damning. 2 possibilities, both of which are relatively damning. One, that he didn't feel like he could because he was scared of Derek Lewis's fearsome counterpunching ability. Or secondly, that he simply couldn't establish the range because Derek Lewis's amazing footwork was too much for him. And
I don't know if
either one of those 2 things is very bad.
It was hard to tell what your opinion on those 2 things was until you said that. You didn't load the the phrasing at all. Yeah, Derek Lewis's phenomenal footwork was too much for him.
Yeah, because this is the thing. Because a lot of that fight was Lewis doing a terrible budget version of the Tyron Woodley thing and sort of huddling up by the fence, and JDS doing exactly what you don't do against the Tyron Woodley strategy and lunging in with huge right hands.
What?
So what was your take? Because I'm getting the impression that you don't feel like that this was a terrible performance.
No, I mean, I do agree. I do want to give like slight credit to Derek Lewis for that terrible performance out of JDS. Like, it may still not be a great sign, but also some of that has to do, I think, with just the depth or lack thereof at heavyweight. I think those two factors combined were sort of what got this performance out of JDS, because he did not use his jab. I wrote an article about this man's body jab before the fight. He threw it maybe twice, and usually that is like, I mean, shit, I can even almost recall the exact numbers. Like, he landed somewhere in the neighborhood of 151 strikes when he fought Ben Rothwell, and like 91 of them were body shots. So normally, like, there's just a lot of straight punches to the body in JDS's style. That is something he does a lot. And so, yeah, it's disconcerting to see him fighting maybe the most body punchable man in the division and not,
or perhaps MMA or the UFC.
Yes. No, I would agree. You might say,
if not Donald Cerrone.
Yeah, you might say Donald Cerrone or Matt Brown, but the thing is those guys fight at welterweight. You know? So, like, they have good fighters hitting them in the body. So, yeah, it's not a great sign. I do want to say, in the early going, I think Lewis had an effect on how Dos Santos was approaching him. Like, very early, Dos Santos was doing what he normally does. He was sort of walking in. He was getting to a pretty close range, right there on the end of jabbing range, like one short step away from landing his left hand, which does happen to be essentially the same slice of range that at which kicks are effective. And Lewis threw almost exclusively kicks as leads in this fight, which made me think, like, it had a real effect on Junior, I think. He became pretty tentative. I think they were really hard. He was blocking them, but they were powerful kicks. So he kept feeling like he had to step out. I think he lost his sense of range as a result. But it did make me think, like, how often have we seen Junior Dos Santos against a kicker? It's not a style he's really faced. And the people who are good kickers that he's fought haven't done much kicking against him. Like, maybe the best one is, I don't know, Gilbert Ivel?
Yep. Well, Overeem probably, but
Overeem, sure.
Overeem didn't need to.
Yeah, Overeem did hit him with some good body kicks, but it was a relatively low volume fight in which he knocked him out with a punch to the chin. So I think it did reveal that like, going forward, JDS does not like dealing with people who kick him. He's not super comfortable countering kicks. Didn't look like it in that one. Maybe that has to do with the huge power on those kicks, but still didn't really seem to think of countering them at all. Whereas Derek Lewis did. He was all kicks from long range, and the one time that JDS threw a low kick that I can recall, Lewis hit him with a huge right hand on the chin, immediately countered like he was waiting for it. And then otherwise, he basically just countered JDS every time JDS hurt him badly with a right hand. But yeah, it was a bad performance from JDS. He ran into some problems, but I think they may be more stylistic issues that we just haven't really seen before. And I want to give just at least a little bit of credit to Derek Lewis for bringing those stylistic issues out. He had a somewhat novel idea of how to approach this opponent. I thought he was fighting maybe one of his better fights. It's not saying that much because it's Derek Lewis and he's kind of bad at everything. But as far as Derek Lewis fights go, I thought he did an okay job. So
I don't know. It just looked like Derek Lewis to me. To be honest, like that's kind of what he does against everyone. He'll just hang out at range and try and throw raw kicks at them. Like, that's why he got taken down a million times by crappy Dagestani guy. He's not crappy.
Shamil Abdurakhimov.
Yeah, Abdurakhimov. All he did was catch kicks and get takedowns and then tire himself out. But yeah, I mean, it was just the fact that, like, it's also something that we noted in the Overeem fight, which is that JDS really doesn't like any kind of movement. he doesn't really like people who consistently move forward on him. And he doesn't like people who move back as well. Because it wasn't just that Lewis was throwing kicks at this, that he was also, like, moving backwards whenever JDS threw something.
And JDS was not much of a pressure fighter.
It was the fact that even when he had fully backed himself up into the fence, JDS couldn't do the incredibly obvious thing of just, like, feinting in behind his shoulder and then, like, touching him with the jab. It was, you're just, like, looking at it going, like, why are you lunging in with no setup right hands and like a huge, like just a huge boot. I hesitate to say front kick. He just like tried to boot him at one point and almost got knocked out for it. Like, but yeah, in the end, Lewis is like fights like a wounded animal, but is not actually all that tough and doesn't have any defense. So it didn't really matter.
Yeah, it was just. I mean, I love Derek Lewis, folks, but this is like. When Tyron Woodley lost to Kamaru Usman, it's like I have to take a moment to be like, look, for all you people who thought I was being too harsh, this is the thing I was talking about. It happened, and it happened so definitively. You have to acknowledge what I've been saying. And every Derek Lewis fight is like that, where it's like you have to acknowledge he's pretty bad. You know, he's really big and he hits really hard, and that's essentially it. So yeah, maybe you're right.
The thing is that I don't know, has anyone actually just gifted it? Because I haven't seen it on Twitter, but like the part where JDS doubled him over with the body shot and then Lewis almost decapitated him with the Scott Smith doubled over overhand. That is what I would show to anyone if they wanted me to encapsulate Derek Lewis's MMA career in 5 seconds.
100%, yes. Absolutely folded in half from a body shot, standing on his feet but bent completely over, and then just very nearly killing a former heavyweight champion with a single right hand. That's Derek Lewis in a nutshell, no doubt. Oh, God. Derek, what have you done to me? Okay, let's move on then. Let's try and run through the rest of this card. Let's see. Elizeu Zaleski dos Santos. Zaleski. We got to come up with a catchier name for this guy. Should we just start calling him Capoeira or Elizeu Zaleski or something? But anyway.
ZDS is the one that people tend to call him in the comment sections.
Okay, all right. That works.
Yeah.
I like, it feels weird to me though. Zaleski took on Curtis Millender. And, we predicted a pretty interesting range battle, a sort of interesting fight between two different directions of movement. One guy more aggressive, more combinations. The other guy a more powerful, better counterpuncher. Pretty interesting dynamic. Was looking forward to seeing it. If I recall, Phil, at the very end of our discussion, we're like, you know what? Dos Santos, he's Brazilian Condit, as you called him, which is a comparison I love more and more, because I also just realized, how handsome Elizeu dos Santos is. And that was always
he is a good-looking man.
He's very handsome. And Carlos Condit is just a beefcake. He's always just been the best-looking guy in the entire sport. So a worthy inheritor of the Carlos Condit violence throne. But we pointed out at the end of our discussion, he's super well-rounded, just like Condit, and just like Condit, he's going to go for everything that seems available just to try it at least once, and that includes takedowns. He does tend to shoot for at least one takedown in every single fight. So that might be a factor, because Melender's ground game is really bad. It was sort of an afterthought in our discussion. Turns out it was the very first and essentially only thought that Dos Santos had to have towards Millender. He hit him really hard with some low kicks, got him to exchange, immediately took him down, and did absolutely whatever he wanted to Millender on the ground.
Yeah, that was kind of awesome. And another one of these, another example, like, hey, being well-rounded actually really works really well sometimes.
Yeah, we had a couple of those last week that I remember you pointing out, or the week before, where like people came in. Maybe it was the one before that. I'm sorry too.
Yeah, I think it was the one before. I think.
Yeah, that's right. We saw Chris Fishgold come in and out-wrestle Daniel Tamer, and we saw Damir Hadjovic out-wrestle Polo Reyes. Neither guy really known for that. And this was a great example. Yeah, like Dos Santos came in, expected a violent striking battle, and he was like, I'm just going to take him down and submit him really quickly.
And one of the more impressive things about this is that, like, if we look at Zaleski's record, his recent record is an amazing run of 7 straight wins, followed by 1 questionable split decision loss to Nicholas Dalby. But like, those last 3 fights, he's taken the least damage of any of his previous ones, really.
Uh-huh.
I mean, the Strickland and Melender fights were he barely took any damage at all.
He started his
and those
UFC...
were the 2 most skilled fighters that he's gone up against.
Yeah.
I mean, Vendramini, fine. But those 2 guys, for Brazilian Condit, like, you would expect him to, like, ride his chin through those fights, and he just didn't.
He started his UFC career off with 5 straight 3-round wars, basically. The Nakamura one wasn't a war, but it was still one where he had to fight his ass off to ensure a win because he lost a clear round. And then his last 3 have all been finishes within the first 6 minutes of the fight. So it's quite a turn. I don't know. Some of that probably has to do with the kinds of opponents he's been fighting. Like Max Griffin, for example, is maybe never going to reach the heights that Curtis Melender has always reached, but he's also like more well-rounded, super athletic, insanely tough, as he showed in that fight. Insanely durable and also very powerful. So like maybe fighting people like Melender and Strickland who have more glaring flaws explains why he's been able to finish them. But at the very least, it's nice to see that when he gets an opponent with flaws, an elite opponent with flaws, he can exploit them in exactly the way he needs to.
Yeah, and it shows that he's not just someone who adapts within the context of a fight like he did against Lyman Good,
right.
But it's someone who comes out with a strategy.
Uh-huh.
And if you can do both of those things and you have a relatively broad skill set, if you're a legit submission threat, if you have an iron chin, if you hit really hard and you keep a really good pace, you are a serious threat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so get this guy a top 10 opponent.
Yeah.
I want to see either that or, if you feel really cruel, make him fight Vicente Luque to see which one gets into the top 10. But boy, would that be a fight.
Yeah, people just like the thing is that you can sort of do this forever in welterweight and lightweight.
True.
Unfortunately, because they're so deep that you can always just be like, you've got a crazy streak. Why don't you just fight the other guy on the crazy streak?
Yeah.
And by the time you come around the next time, there's still another guy on a crazy streak, and eventually you just end up with these guys who never get a crack at a still relatively aging and like ripe for turnover top 15.
I'm glad you said that. I was just about to raise the same point. Like the welterweight top 10, we've had some shakeups, but it still feels pretty stagnant and a little outdated. And I think
like,
both.
Why is Thompson fighting Pettis?
Right. What the fuck is that? Yeah, I think both Dos Santos and Luque could very easily slot into that top 10 if they just get the right matchup to break in. But it was definitely like a contender-proving kind of performance. Dos Santos came in with a clear game plan, took advantage of an obvious flaw super impressively. And yeah, I like to see multiple kinds of adaptability from a fighter whose main calling card is being super violent. He is a must-watch fighter and only getting more so. So very good stuff from Dos Santos there. What else from this card do we want to hit? I feel like we have to talk about the brutal knockout Nico Price handed Tim Means in their fight after getting almost brutally knocked out like 2 or 3 separate times by Tim Means.
He is officially welterweight's most light heavyweight fighter.
Abso-fucking-lutely.
In that,
yes.
You're just going to look at him and like he's just going to pick up finishes, and you'll just look at them and be like, awesome, I guess.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, I mean, I'm here for it.
Mm-hmm.
He's one of these guys, he has no visible tremendous athleticism, like doesn't look particularly fast or strong or anything, but he clearly just hits like a fucking truck.
Yep. He's one of those fighters with huge hands.
And has internalized that.
Yep.
And which means he's occasionally going to be able to beat people, including those who are kind of visibly better than him, like Tim Means.
Yes, Tim Means. Man, I feel so much for Tim Means. Like, in terms of striking skill, Tim Means is among the very best, regardless of division in this sport. He's a really good striker. And it's just a shame that this had to happen. He also got crow-copped on his way down. He, his leg twisted weirdly. I think he tore his Achilles or something. So, Bad stuff. Before there's one more from this main card that I want to hit, and that's really the last one from the main card I want to hit. That's Dariush Dober. But before we hit that, I want to hit the one prelim fight that we have to discuss, which has a sort of parallel to the Tim Means Nico Price fight. That's of course Anthony Rocco's Martin Life, who fought Sergio Moraes in the featured prelim. And this is me crossing programs here, but I talked to Zane, of course, on the MMA Zane Simon, who's to be blamed for everything, on last week's MMA Vivisection. And, he loves Sergio Moraes, as do I. It's sort of like a communicable disease, a love for Sergio Moraes, and Zane has definitely given it to me. But we were talking about the parallels between Rocco Martin as an opponent for Moraes, the parallels between Rocco Martin and Tim Means, who had fought Moraes just before. In my opinion, won a contested split decision, but certainly had a super competitive fight with Sergio Moraes. And there's a real difference between both guys are good counter fighters, and that was expected to be their advantage against Moraes. But it's interesting to see the different ways that developing styles really play out. There's a huge difference between the style of counterpunching that Rocco Martin employs and that of Tim Means. The main thing is how each one controls or doesn't control the pace of the fight. And Tim Means fought Sergio Moraes, and Means has never been a fighter who really specializes in limiting exchanges or slowing the pace down. He's exceptionally good technically as a striker, but a lot of his quality comes through in how well he exchanges with people. He comes back with these great counter combinations, slides straight punches right inside the looping shots of his opponent, all this beautiful, precise counter punching. But if you can walk through that, you're going to get to have an exchange with him and test his defense and test his chin. And that's what happened with him when he fought Sergio Moraes. Moraes got to have a lot of fun fighting Tim Means because he got to fight him. And counter to that, go on. Tim Means is a guy who keeps a high but rhythmically consistent and hence somewhat exploitable pace. Yes.
Similar to someone like Bisping.
Yeah.
This is why both guys would have the same, often the same kind of performances at a sort of macro level, where it would just be they're winning. Sudden explosion from the opponent. Will he recover? If he does, he goes back to winning consistently. It's because it's always kind of on beat. He's never going to turn down an exchange. He's never just going to say, you know what? No, thank you.
He's going to capitalize as best he can on the exchange. And there was a clear difference between that fight with Moraes and Rocco Martin, who very visibly frustrated the hell out of Sergio Moraes. Moraes hated that fight. And that's the thing. Means let him have fun, and Moraes made hay with that. He did enough that two judges gave him a win. Nobody gave him even a minute of a single round here. It was an exceedingly professional performance from Rocco Martin. He controlled a crafty and dangerous vet, picked him apart bit by bit, largely the jab and the savage low kicks. But it was like a McDonald Ellenberger type performance. He figured out what he needed to do to win, and Moraes was never able to adjust to it, and so Martin just won very comfortably. I thought it was, maybe not like a performance you'll remember, maybe not full of highlights, but sort of like we were saying with Leon Edwards' wins, a really consummate victory.
Yep. Moraes wanted to play Rocco Soccer Robots, and Anthony Rocco Martin was not having it.
That was good. That was very good. Okay, finally, a few quick words, because we're running out of time here. Beneil Dariush, Drew Dober. I'll let you take the lead on this one.
You know what? Good stuff from Drew Dober.
Absolutely.
I'm going to say that, he genuinely impressed me. He did exactly the right things he needed to do to win this fight.
He has turned a corner.
And it didn't win in the fight. Yeah. It didn't win in the fight, but, anyone who looked at that fight knew what he had to do. He had to be fearless. He had to force exchanges. He had to try and capitalize on Dariush's weak chin, because that was one of the only areas, and, somewhat suspect defense, because that was the only areas where Dariush wasn't just better than him. Mm-hmm. Dariush was is historically a bigger puncher, a better wrestler, and a more dangerous submission grappler. But damned if Drew Dober didn't almost win that fight. But then again, conversely, got to give the credit to Dariush for turning it around and going back to what has got him his biggest wins, and something which still has been an issue with Dober. He's a guy who's a willing offensive wrestler, but like a lot of that, I think he's team elevation. Mm-hmm. They do have a slight tendency to they do tend to have slight gaps in their technical defensive wrestling games. Mm-hmm. And that kind of got exposed again here. And Dariush got him with that ridiculous armbar setup. Mm-hmm. Looked like it was going for it was a reverse triangle initially, right?
First, he
turned it into the armbar as he was. Oh yeah, that was what he was talking about. Of course, yes.
He talked about the Kimura trap in his post-fight interview. He locked in the Kimura from top half guard. Kimura being like an extremely strong grip. Tom Grant has both explained and demonstrated this on me. Explained it to and demonstrated it on me. His Kimura is quite painful, by the way. It's like not when he's cranking it, just the grip. It hurts more than you would expect. It's really tight. And it's all about as he explained it, all about basically the short, you make the distance between their bicep and your grip on your own wrist as short as it can possibly be. So basically you really choke up, you bend their arm as much as you can. Dariush had a super tight Kimura grip, based on those metrics. And so then he sort of allowed himself to sort of fall forward out of half guard, allowed Dober to roll while he still had the grip locked in, and then got that reverse triangle, still threatening the Kimura, and then turned it into a straight armbar. But yeah, really, really beautiful work with that from Dariush. The only two things I want to say. Drew Dober has turned a corner, I think, as a fighter. If you are going to knock Dariush for almost losing to Dober, you have to give Dober credit for the improvements he's made since going to Elevation. And that was a really impressive pressure, power punching performance from him. He was throwing combinations. He was feinting his way in. He was doing all the shit we wanted to see JDS do to Derek Lewis, against a much better fighter. He backed Dariush up. He feinted his way into range. He hit him when he was trying to exchange with the left hand over the top. It was all looking really solid. And then, after Dariush got the much-needed takedown in the second round, this, to me, was the key moment of the fight. Drew Dober popped out of back mount. Dariush got in his back. Dober slipped out the back door and then re-engaged in the wrestling. He went back in, dove in on Dariush's back, and Dariush hit a switch on him and took him back down, and then finished him like within a minute after that. Huge mistake in fight IQ. So I feel for Drew Dober. I like to see Beneil Dariush is one of MMA's like real good guys, though, so I like to see him win. He's a better fighter than he usually gets credit for. But I thought it was a performance where, like, it was a tale of two fights. Both guys got to show what makes them such good fighters, and I don't think Drew Dober should really lose stock for this performance because, like, yeah, he was really, really close to winning it, even if he did then kind of throw it all away. All right.
Yep, agreed.
Yeah, well, that's UFC Wichita, and we are very much looking forward to next week's event in London, and we hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Heavy Hands. Before we wrap it up for good, Phil, have you anything coming out this week?
Oh, just the preview of Till Masvidal. Nothing other than that, I think.
Cool. As for me, keep your eyes peeled on BE for a piece breaking down Mikey Garcia versus Errol Spence Jr. That's coming up on the 16th. Boxing gets its chance to have a super fight. They really wish they were as successful as the UFC, don't they? Just mimicking the time-tested UFC model of throwing super fights together that no one really asked for. Everyone's impressed by Mikey Garcia taking this fight. I don't think many people expect him to win. It might look a lot like the super fights we've been getting in the UFC, where the smaller fighter just tends to lose most of the time. But I'm going to write an article on Errol Spence's infighting, which is really good and technical and brutal, and it's great. So keep your eyes out on Bloody Elbow for that. Find us on social media if you want to talk about these articles or any of the outrageous things we said on this show. You can find Phil on Twitter at EvilGregJackson and myself at BoxingBush, BUSCH. And otherwise, that is it for us. Thank you all so much for listening. If you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.